and welcome back once again to the adventures of the monk and the monarch. As always, you have me, the monarch, and my host, Mildra the monk.
Hello.
In the past, we've looked over various American dubbing studios that have closed down, so we thought, let's take a try at looking at some of the actual anime studios from the past that have shut down. And the first on that list, Studio Xebec.
Yes. It's time to talk about the Xebec face.
Now, these guys started a good while ago, early 90s.
1995, if we want to get really
Yeah.
pedantic.
Now, it might have been 94. It's not uncommon for a studio to open and then their first projects released like a year or two after the fact.
I mean, yeah,
But,
you actually have to spend time making the
yeah.
thing. But
But yeah, their first
they did
project
have,
was 95.
yeah, which was unfortunately Sorcerer Hunters.
That is not exactly the best one to kick off with from what I've read. I did not watch this one, but I don't really recall hearing a lot of great things.
I have occasionally made jokes at its expense. The big ones being that Sorcerer Hunters is what happens when your D&D campaign is run by idiots. I know for a lot of people they look at it as a poor man's Slayers. I'm not going to go that far because I don't think Slayers should own fantasy anime the way some people think. At the same time, though, it does feel a little similar to other works, so I can see why people would make that remark.
I'd probably chalk more of those similarities up to the source material than Xebec themselves.
Yeah,
But that's still not
again,
something you want to like come swinging out the gate with. Something that's immediately going to get compared to something else everybody already loves.
it didn't help that it came out around the same time, and well, it was in that same wave of ADV releases. So even if one could argue a chicken and egg situation, it's ultimately meaningless because for those of us stateside, we ended up getting them around the same time. In particular, during the early days of that feeding frenzy we've talked about regarding the early 2000s.
Yeah. But I think it's their next project that actually kind of started to get them known to more people with Martian successor Nadesco.
Yeah, I know a lot of people only know of it due to Giant Robot Week on Toonami, but I have a soft spot for Nadesco. I'm well aware that the manga is significantly different from the anime, but
Something
for
very
the mo
common around this time.
yeah, but I don't adhere to this idea that we have to be slavishly accurate to the manga, and in some cases, doing that is actually the worst case scenario. The big example I often use when it comes to that kind of thing is Blame. Blame, I do not think works as a anime. I think it has to be a manga, just because of the way it's set up.
But yeah, that said, with Nadesco, even like in the mid 90s, I think this is like a bit before anime really started blowing up, even with the ADV stuff. A lot of people here knew what Nadesco was.
Yeah, I think it was only until years later when people started getting more access to Go Nagai's work that there was an understanding of what Geki Ganger 3 was supposed to be a parody of. In fact, the fact that the entire anime is a giant parody of not just mecha, but also mecha fandoms.
Yeah. But even without having a lot of knowledge of that, a lot of people did really enjoy this one. It's got a
And
pretty strong following to this day.
yeah, I should note on my end that from what I understand, a lot of the people who would be the foundation of Xebec were former Toei animation people who mainly left because of not liking the way things were going at Toei. And I know in one case he specifically left because of because of Shinichiro Shirakura to the point where he publicly declared he would never work under Shirakura ever again. And granted, it's not like he was one of the founding members of Xebec. Naruhisa Arikawa, who is a name that has a lot of credits as a writer and script writer, especially in both anime and tokusatsu. And he didn't work for them for over a decade. It wasn't until Kira Major in the Super Sentai that he had actually done writing for them. And I imagine it's because they end up crawling to him because of the state of things with Sentai, rather than the opposite. Mostly because a lot of the stuff that he was involved in, even though he basically wrote the book on how to write a modern Sentai season, they weren't following the play. They weren't following any playbook, and there was a lot of not necessarily failures, but underperformances as far as Toei was concerned. But there's a long, long list of people Shirakura has pissed off to the point that there was a public poll about whether or not he should be ousted from his position. I bring that up because that's something to take into consideration when you're dealing with Xebec. The other thing is the infamy of what I mentioned before, the Xebec face. Xebec did not have a very high budget, especially in the 2000s when everybody was shifting to DigiPaint. And when it came to character designers, they would often use the same character designer for multiple shows, which is why a lot of character designs, especially regarding like the eyes, really end up looking similar in a lot of Xebec animation.
This is something I've noticed, like looking back and seeing like a lot of people kind of talk or give their thoughts on Xebec from around the time they closed till various bits till now. Their reputation's a little all over the place. In a way,
Yeah,
I
and
don't
it's
think we've really seen on anything we've covered on this show yet.
granted a lot of studios will handle a lot of different projects, but some studios are a bit more consistent than others in terms of what projects they tackle.
There is not much consistency here with Zabek. Like, I'm going to use a quick three examples from 99 to 2000. They went from Zoid's Chaotic Century, Love Hina,
Hmm.
Pilot Candidate.
Oh yes, Pilot Candidate or Candidate for Goddess.
Oh god.
The anime's so bad that Adult Swim took multiple pot shots at it over the years since, and has outright, and in some cases outright refused to acknowledge that they ever aired it.
Okay, here's the thing. Like, I remember when Pilot Candidate first aired. I remember seeing an episode. I don't know. It was a random one, so I don't know what it was. I remember the first time seeing it. It's like, this is okay, but for some reason I just never watched it again. Years later, I kept reading, everyone hated Pilot Candidate. I'm like, was it really that bad? I made it through the first episode. I'm like, nope, done. Not going back to this one. What the hell was wrong with younger me?
Yeah, no.
Maybe a later episode was better than the first one.
Well, the problem is this was one of those ending on a cliffhanger kind of things.
Another very common thing to happen around this era.
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and I will admit that one of the big elephants in the room when it came to Pilot Candidate was the CG.
One of the things I'm going to note about Xebec around here too, these early years of anime, they seem to be one of the ones that more regularly included CG. Like, it wasn't new to anime, but
But
I think they were one of the only studios that like regularly included it and incorporated it into a lot of their
the
shows around
only
this
other
time.
major one I can think of that used a lot of CG in their work was Gonzo, and it was really obvious when they did.
Yeah.
I know I keep saying this a lot, but it is important to note how much of a transitional period the early 2000s were when it came to animation. And the big part of that was things like DigiPaint and things like using CG, just moving towards more digital tools. There was a massive jump towards that in the early 2000s. Some studios, like say Madhouse and Production IG, were able to weather that storm. But not everybody can be Madhouse or Production IG. They're the cream of the crop.
Yeah. But another thing I do remember in relation to that,
Hmm.
2007 Heroic Age. One of the big things that was kind of like really hyped up, it was going to be one of the first like anime that was going to be released on Blu-ray. First anime I ever bought on Blu-ray because I thought it looked good. And I think at the time that was probably like the most heavily CG focused anime we'd gotten up to that date.
I will be flat out honest. I have never been the biggest fan of CG in anime. And a big reason for that is, to be honest, it just takes me out of the moment.
Many times for me it does too, but I am going to grant Xebec a bit of leniency here because I did recently rewatch Heroic Age. I also rewatched their DN Angel series. I see why there are people who will look back and say Xebec was just famously kind of not very good at animation. I don't think that's the case. Yes, some of the CG in DN Angel does look a little odd, but I don't think it actually looks that bad going back and watching it now. Xebec is definitely a budget studio, but I think they made good use of this budget of their smaller budgets. I don't think they were bad animation by any stretch of the word.
They were
Usually.
limited, but I would not call what they were doing bad.
Yeah. And again, recently rewatched Heroic Age. I think it's a very good looking show. I don't think the CG pulls you out as much in something like this because so much of it is CG. It's not like suddenly you see like this 2D animation and awkward CG layered over the top of it. So it all kind of flows a lot better. I'm not
Pretty
saying
much.
that applies to all of their work, obviously.
Oh, definitely.
Like, they've done enough shows. Like, we have skipped huge gaps for the couple shows we brought up. I'm sure some of these look bad. It's bound to happen. Even Madhouse has
And
turned out some kind of questionable stuff over their many years.
yeah, nobody's gonna bat 1,000. I'd say they did take advantage of that just explosion of material that we started to see in the 2000s. You already mentioned Zoid's Chaotic Century, which of these Zoids anime that have been released, I consider that one the best, mostly because it tried to have a bit more coherence of a story, at least trying to expand beyond that. They were responsible for the first run with Shaman King. The second one looks to be better, but that's still a work in progress.
The more recent
And
one.
yeah, and obviously, when you're dealing with adaptations of shonen battle manga, you have to deal with the fact that it's being adapted while that manga is still in the works.
I don't think that's the case with Shaman King right now, is it? Or is it still going?
Shaman King is finished. A
Yeah.
sequel series is being done, but that's not what's being adapted. Obviously, the big one is Rockman EXE or Mega Man NT Warriors. It was known stateside. That particular one had some troubles during its development.
And also I'll
I
also give him credit for Love Hina. Regardless of what you think of it, it has a lasting fan base.
Yeah. Something I ended up finding recently is that even despite me looking at it as kind of meh, apparently Fafner had it got a sizable fan following in Japan.
Huh. That I did not know. I think stateside a lot of people just didn't really care.
I look at it as shit rolls downhill because it had the same character designer as Gundam Seed, which could certainly play a factor into that kind of thing. There's a few other ones. Elemental Jade. I remember. I didn't know it under that name, but it's amusing to see that in the list.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, there's just a lot of stuff. If we ever do a retrospective on Battleship Yamato, we'll have to bring up their take on Star Blazers from 2012, even though that was a collaboration with AIC. AIC is one of the big OGs when it comes to animation studios that are still doing things. You look at, say, Madhouse, and there's usually a bit of consistency as far as what they're going to be doing. Most of what Madhouse does is going to be action anime. That's what they're going to be. That's what they're going to be good at. But we cannot understate how completely all over the place
I mean, that was the example I
these
brought
guys.
up earlier, going from Zoids to Love Hina.
Yeah,
It is everything on that gambit you're going to see out of these guys.
and that's not to throw shade at Love Hina.
Yeah.
It has its place
Yeah.
in weeb lore.
Yeah. I'm just meaning more of the style, because you can't get much different than Zoids and Love Hina in terms of what you're going for. They're about opposite ends of the spectrum. So nothing was off limits to these guys, which I can't really think of many other studios you could say that about.
I'm
Yeah.
sure there's a few. I'm also sure that it's a very wide affair.
But that said,
But
like looking at this like list of TV works they've done, there is something to kind of note here, and that's there are not a lot of shows on this list that really stand out as classics.
yeah, there's a lot that are good or okay, but not necessarily ones that I think a lot of people are gonna go back to in that way. And I have a suspicion that a good reason for that is that they had the approach of they would take any and all contracts that they could get because of the fact that they were a smaller budgeted studio.
Which has its advantages and its drawbacks.
So when it comes to things that they've done that would probably be considered stuff that has its place in history, the main ones that come to mind is things like Nadesco and Love Hina.
I
When it
think
comes to the
I'd
others,
put Heroic Age in there, less for necessarily how much people liked it, but again, more that was, as I mentioned earlier, the first just heavily CG'd anime. And I do remember it doing quite well.
I've heard that the buddy fight stuff did all right in Japan, but I'm getting this from 3 or 4 degrees of separation, so take of
Yeah.
that what you will. They did work on one episode of the Blue Seed sequel OVA, but only weirdos like me are going to remember Blue Seed, and I don't remember much of the sequel series because that was a story that had already. When you have a story that definitively finishes, having it do a sequel entry is always going to feel awkward.
I will note they've also done a few game animations, mostly Mega Man X and Killer 7.
Yeah, and
Okay,
in those
that may
cases, it
be
was
about as polar opposite to Love Hina as you're going to get on this list as Killer 7.
pretty much. And there was I know that there was also the Shaman King thing, but apparently they also had a hand in working on stuff for Black Clover, which I've seen a lot of people turn up their nose when it comes to Black Clover and say, "Oh, it's just a poor man's fairy tale or a poor man's Naruto." I'm not saying that that's wrong per se, but I feel like a lot of people who were doing that dismissal were missing out on the bigger picture because those series have come along enough that people who were inspired by it are going to be taking it and doing their own thing with it.
I
And
never saw
I
Black
think
Clover, but it's got a following these days. I think it's one of those shows that actually got more popular well after it started and ended. Unless it
yeah, sometimes that does happen. I mean, there was the whole thing with certain films not doing well in the theaters but doing really well in VHS to the point where they get a second chance. The point is that this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. On the other hand, you've got stuff like Dice, which who the hell remembers that
I
except me?
remember the name.
Probably only because that's also the name of the studio that does Battlefield.
No, I remember an anime with that name. I couldn't tell you anything about it, but you kind of start to realize that's a big part of the trend with Xebec. 90% of these shows, who remembers this stuff? Tokyo ESP?
Mhm.
Soft Tenny? Which is a tennis show, apparently.
We already have anime in tennis form.
But yeah, this kind of, I think, very early on, if you were watching Xebec, you might have seen their inevitable fall. Because again, we may have started with something like Nadesco, their first kind of popular and well received one. Then we've got like 6 more shows before he hit Zoid Chaotic Century. And I'm not saying the shows before this aren't necessarily remembered. I do think there's still some love for Dygard, but not a huge amount. Then, of course, you've
And
got your pilot candidate after Zoids and Love Hina.
The problem ultimately when it comes to say Die Guard is conceptually people are going to look at it as leaning a bit too close to stuff like Getter Robo, and it's most definitely not a one-to-one. But when you have a mech that's piloted by three people, the comparison is going to get brought up.
Yeah, then
I'm
what
not
after?
defending it. I'm just noting it.
Yeah, then we got a few more before we hit Rockman, which I can't vouch how well that did in Japan, but I think it was his best okay received here in the States. DN Angel still has a pretty decent following these days.
I've heard the Angel, the manga is still ongoing, or at least it was at one point until another one of those
Yeah.
extended hiatuses.
2021, the manga ended, but
Mhm.
now they're doing, or she's doing DDN Angels, a sequel. I will say something interesting about the DN Angel anime apparently, because since she was going on hiatus, anime was going, they weren't going to be able to finish. She actually talked with the Xebec people and told them her ideas for how the show wanted to end. So the series still ends largely the same way the manga ends. Now it's obviously a little more rushed and there's a lot of bit missing there at the end, but the show did get the ending the manga wanted, which is nice.
Mhm.
You can't always say that with these projects.
No,
But then after DN Angel, it's a decent sized list before you hit Heroic Age. Again, a bunch of stuff people barely remember. Like, I don't even think Elemental Jade was that well known.
no, not really. And again, with all the ones that we're putting in this, it's not that any of these were bad. Aside from something like Pilot Candidate, which you could just as well blame on the source material. But I would hesitate to call that to call anything beyond that they've done bad in that sense.
This is still a studio of just a lot of mediocre to bad successes,
Mhm.
regardless of show quality.
I know it would be tempting to say, well, if they're that meh, then why spend a whole lot of time on them particularly? The thing about it is, even with all those problems, when Xebec picks up a project, you never knew what exactly you were going to get. I think something that certainly didn't help is because of that explosion of availability, the idea was quantity over quality. I'd say that problem is still there, just it's shifted over to put more stuff on streaming
Yeah.
services. The more things don't change and all that because of the fact that they went all over the place, they're always doing something different. I'd say one of the things that may have been the canary in the coal mine was when they split themselves into like three studios. Because in 2003 they put out Xebec M2 as a subsidiary, which was a helper studio for their main studio as well as for other projects, including OLM, who handles a lot of Pokemon movies. That only lasted until 2010. Then they followed that up with Xebex Y, which was basically doing the same thing of being a helper studio for Xebec and others. They were responsible for Fafnir. It's the question of if they're this small, why do you keep trying to set up your own helper studio? Both of which don't even last all that long. M2 lasted from 2003 to 2009, and Xebex Vi ran from 2010 to 2015. Now, apparently, the reason why that kind of thing happened, at least for the 2009 one, was the director Hideyuki Monohashi leaving. As far as what impact that had, I can't really say. I realize that as the tech gets more complicated, you're gonna need more people. I don't know. Maybe they were trying to do what production IG does, where they will bring in helper studios. But the reason helper studios are a thing is because of the fact that you're messing around with a weekly show. And you need people to fill in the gaps in order to get things done on time. It could be possible that they just didn't want to eat. They either didn't want to go outside of Japan or just didn't have the money to do it. about 2010, when Xebec Y went out, they ended up doing a few other things in the years since, and then would eventually get absorbed into into Sunrise and Production IG. Some parts going to Production IG and some parts going to Sunrise, including the building that they were in. And then the founder found in 2019 would found Studio Mother, which could be considered Xebec's successor.
Now that's still a relatively new one, and I don't know too much about Studio Mother yet. Have they done anything of note?
Not really, except for more of Space Battleship Yamato in 2010 and Be Forever Yamato Rebel 3199, which is supposed to be a sequel to Star Blazers, or rather Star Blazers 2205. That came out in July. When it comes to TV series, they've done stuff based on based on romance novels and one isekai light novel. One of them isn't supposed to come out until July.
So I guess it's still kind of out on how
Hmm.
Mother's gonna pan out.
Yeah, keep in mind a lot of the assets were sold off by their parent company, which was IG Port, over to Sunrise. Apparently the big reason for the sale was that the parent company was bleeding money. But apparently Studio Mother was given some funding through the Bandai Namco family, and mainly in order to get a stronger relationship when it comes to the Yamato franchise. So it's a studio that was built for Yamato. I'm reminded of those blockbuster trades you often see in sports where a king's ransom will be done to keep hold of one person.
Yeah, I will note for Xebec, the last project they had before they basically were bought out and absorbed was Space Battleship Yamato 2202.
Hmm.
Fafnir not being completed until after the buyout. Who was it? Production IG took
Yeah,
over for that one, I believe.
pretty much.
Now, this is an interesting one because there wasn't really a very interesting reason to bring up why Xebec ended up folding. They just didn't make shows that did well consistently.
They made shows, and they did all right, but I think it was more that the way the economy was going, and the fact that all of their competitors were doing like gangbusters, especially as we get into the mid to late 2010s. And you've got a bunch of studios who are doing these big marquee things that are getting international acclaim. I could see an investor looking at Zabek and going, "Why aren't you doing things at that level?" And I have to wonder, and keep in mind, this is me putting my tinfoil hat on. Why does this thing still fits me? I can't help but wonder if doing Yamato was a Hail Mary. A lot of the stuff that they did up until that point was either adaptations of manga or original properties. Not really any kind of legacy work. I'm trying to think what would be the closest things to that. But I will also note that a good amount of Zabek's operations got transferred over to the Sunrise Beyond company, which was meant to be an animation studio that was doing stuff you would expect Sunrise to do, but not necessarily mecha, or not necessarily get essentially falling into the trap of doing Gundam.
I actually think another thing of note for why this might have happened, they started off as a small kind of low budget studio, but they were doing a lot of projects generally at once. Like Zoids, Love Hina, and Pilot Candidate were all being worked on in the same year.
Mm-hmm.
They were working on Rockman, Bottle Fairy, DN Angel, and Stelvia all in the same year.
Yeah.
It
Although
wasn't
I
uncommon
should
for them
note,
to be on four
yeah,
projects per year for one small studio.
I should note that Sunrise Beyond, a few in January of last year, was dissolved and merged with Sunrise, and then you have just and Sunrise themselves isn't just one studio. It's like 13 different studios. Some of them doing in between stuff, some of them doing
Yeah.
other stuff under different names, some of them sister studios to other studios.
Yeah.
Like if I were to try and piece it all together, it would look like that one conspiracy meme.
Yeah. But I will note also, I was just mentioning the TV series at the time. There were also OVAs and movies they were working on simultaneously with these TV series during these same years.
Hmm.
They spread themselves rather thin for a lot of projects that, with the rare exception, just did okay.
Would you say one of the things that did them in then was the fact that they were just doing everything under the sun?
Yeah, like it's not the disparity of what they worked on. It's the volume they were doing it at. There's only so much work one studio is going to be able to handle.
Only so many plates you can spin.
Yeah. Because you
It,
could see some genuinely good stuff come out of them. Considering
mhm.
what they had to work with DN Angel getting cut short and them having to rush an ending, I think that show actually holds up very well today. Same thing with Heroic Age, which is one of their original works.
I do wonder when it comes to D and Angel how much of that is due to the soundtrack, which I know that they did work with Star Child at least once. And if you're going to have a very strong soundtrack, then you're inevitably going to be working with Star Child.
I think Xebec had a lot of talent that they just never really were able to showcase. So it makes me sad they have kind of such this huge catalog of just okay. I think maybe if they took on like half the projects and spent more time on each one, they might have ended up with a much bigger modern fan base than they currently have.
That is a possibility.
Yeah, that is just speculation, just looking at them from the outside, though. So it's hard
Mhm.
to say, but I think they definitely left a mark, and a lot of people do look back on. They like. I did mention you. It is easy to find people who look back and just think Xebec was a terrible animation studio, but you also see a lot of people who do look back very fondly on a number of items from their catalog.
Though when it comes to the folk who are like, it was they were completely terrible and all that. How much of that is legit, and how much of that is people being performative? The that performative
Yeah.
cynicism I rail on
I think
every chance I
some of
get.
it's legit because again, looking back, I do think DN Angel still looks very good, but at the same time, it does look dated. So I can kind of see it because none of their stuff was ever the best looking shows of the era.
Yeah.
You may be able
Although
to make that case for
to
Heroic
their
Age.
credit with DN Angel, one of the writers on that, Naruhisa Arakawa.
Yeah,
Another thing is that when it came to the CG that they did use, it was never character CG. It was usually environment, like CGing a brick wall background and having it heavily darkened, so it'd be difficult to notice that it's CG.
or any of the scopes over the town.
Mhm.
Those did look awkward. I'm not gonna lie.
But it showcases an understanding that if CG is not used properly, it's going to take people out of the moment,
Yeah.
which is something I've been saying
Yeah.
about using CG in anime for years.
I am happy there are people who do hold this studio just in fond memory. I think in the
This,
grand scheme, that's going to be the view that wins out in regards to Xebec.
for a whole generation, a lot of stuff that people watched that got where they got their start in anime came from them.
I don't think that a lot of people got the start there, but once you started on it, you were probably coming across a number of things, so it was going to be at the beginning. But very few
Mhm.
people, I think, jumped into anime because of a lot of their shows. They were just kind
No,
of
it's just
always there part of the beginning process.
Mhm. Like I could see somebody. Well, a lot of the gateway drug anime that they did produce was stuff that was on either network television in the case of something like NT Warrior, or cable television. As people were starting to get more and more
Yeah.
access to cable, the whole on-demand thing was going through its birth pangs at the moment. That's not to play apologist or something like that, but just to acknowledge where things were.
Yeah.
I do think that because of the fact that a lot of people got their start with it, that's going to help matters. It honestly wasn't until around 2005 that I started to notice the sameness when it came to some of their facial designs.
Yeah. Once you kind of start to notice it does stick with you. Again, though, it's one of those things I can kind of forgive because if you just are watching him on and off, you're probably not going to register that it's the same face. They do a good enough job with the window dressing to distract from that, for the most part.
Pretty much.
There isn't really a whole lot to the story of Xebec themselves. They were just a small studio. They had their mark. Got a bit of the short end of the stick, possibly, with some questionable projects they took on.
When it comes to the latter projects, were there any ones that you can think of that was a case of this was just a bad source material to adapt? I mean, I already made fun of Sorcerer Hunters, but I'm not going to blame them for that.
Honestly, it's kind of a thing. A lot of them, I don't think many of the projects where the source material they took on are things that really ever had a huge fan base. So you don't hear too much about a lot of it, which also
That's
might not have helped them out.
Yeah, probably.
Because, you attach your name to a big name in manga as you release it over in Japan, it's probably going to get you a lot more attention than Tokyo ESP, which I feel are
What?
kind of the majority of what they got.
I do remember looking at how Zombie Loan was on the list. I do remember seeing one episode of that, and I never finished it. I don't remember why I didn't. Why stopped. I just stopped.
There might have been a good reason for it.
Sometimes it's just a gut instinct, and I cannot fully explain it. And other times it's because I was legitimately appalled by what I was looking at. These things are never consistent.
With Heroic Age being one of the ones that they did that actually did do quite well and got a lot of attention, I wonder what their future would have looked like if that's kind of what they opted to do going forward, is less picking up all of these random projects of different source material and just focusing on creating their own stuff.
If that's what they did, they'd probably be in the position that they'd probably be able to eventually, just through having a bunch of projects, be able to better pick which ones they
Yeah.
would be able to keep.
That said, it's hard to say, like, did they have that many good ideas for original projects?
I think it's just as
Yeah.
likely that because again, feeding frenzy, all the bigger projects were going to other people.
Yeah.
That's my theory at the very least.
Yeah, it's entirely possible they just picked a really bad time to start that studio. Because when you have that competition and you're a bunch of effectively no names, like they all did kind of had names working for other people, but it's entirely possible just no one really wanted to trust them with that much at the time. And even when they did have their successes like Love Hina, there was always a bunch of people around them doing better. So I think
I
timing
could
had a part
certain.
of it.
Mhm.
I also think just taking on so much and just seemingly having very little, what's the word, quality control in what you're picking up.
Yeah.
I think those are the three things that have kind of plagued them from the very beginning. But they made it 20
Would
years off of that.
yeah. Would it also be possible that some of the early blunders, like Candidate for Goddess, may have caused a shit rolls downhill kind of situation?
Possibly, but again, with stuff like Heroic Age, they showed they rebounded from that. They could still get eyes on them and make good stuff people cared about. So I don't think it helped, but I don't think it was one of the bigger issues.
That's fair.
Especially since I think people kind of forgot about Canada or Goddess anyway. Just they locked that away in the little back part of their mind and never remember again.
Apparently, I guess Adult Swim didn't get that memo. Which, and the only reason I know about that kind of thing is because, well, Lord knows I can be that petty. And I got nothing to hide on that front.
I have gotten people at my job to try to stop out pitying me. It has never worked out well for them.
They do realize that they just set up a self-fulfilling prophecy, don't they?
Oh yeah, because we had like a little bell, kitchen, ring when the food's in. One of the server ladies didn't like me ringing it, so she took it away when I wasn't looking. So I just started screaming out ding, 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 ding whenever I put up an order.
Until, let me guess, they eventually put it back up.
Yep. Don't try to out-petty me. I have no shame. I can get way worse than that.
I mean, obviously you have no shame. You work with me.
But yeah, all that said, my overall thoughts on them as a studio. Again, I think they were very talented. Despite low budgets, I do think their stuff consistently looked good. And I kind of wish we still had them around. So it was sad when they closed down.
Yeah, I mean, the people who work there are working in other places, whether it be Studio Mother or elsewhere.
I think a number of them are still with IG Productions.
Probably. Except IG Productions, or Production IG, is a monolith.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's the largest studio in Japan, but it's certainly the one that seems to have the lion's share of work. That's been my take at the very least.
Yeah, their name pops up everywhere.
It was like during that one time where a certain voice actress just kept popping up in everything I happen to be watching. And it's not like I was going out of my way to look for her. She just I'm watching a random anime and there she is. It was like a drinking game for about 5 or 6 years.
It's alright, that happened to me. Like, it was the guy who voiced Radar Man in Paranoia Agent. I'm trying to remember the detective's name. The taller, skinny one.
Mm-hmm.
He did the Radar Man guy. Like, he came up everywhere in just American dubs. Once I looked up his name, like, holy shit. He's been in a lot of stuff I've really liked.
I will note that when it comes to researching who dubbed what in like early 2000s, it becomes a royal pain because a lot of times people were using pseudonyms.
Yeah.
I'm not blaming them for using pseudonyms. I know that there's reasons why that became a thing that are complicated, but just from a doing my research perspective, that's why you end up with some false positives is the best way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that kind of, though, wraps up the thoughts on Studio Xebec. Again, this wasn't one of the more in-depth episodes we've done, but that's just kind of the story of Xebec. It's just what it was on the surface. You didn't have any weird backseat power struggles. No crazy shenanigans happened with them.
And you had some people who despised where they used to work, but that's the whole other story.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess with all that wrapped up, we'll bring our story of Xebec to an end. Now it'll be a little bit before we upload this, but once it is, you're free to catch both me and Zan on Thursday evenings doing our Valley of the Judge, talking about various tabletop RPGs. I don't want to give a name yet because I don't know what it's going to be off the top of my head for the Thursday after this comes up.
The one I can.
Let's see. This will be.
And
up
I think you confused me with Zan because
I said Zan, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
I don't even do Valley with Zan.
No, I've only done a 3-person Valley. I only did 3-person Valleys during season 1 when I had myself and Ash on. I did it the one time where I brought in Theo, and that's it when it comes to the 3-person thing. I haven't done that in a while. But no, our one-shot after Titan Effect is The Dig, and then after that we're doing Shroud of the Ancients.
Oh, that ought to be fun. So with that, we will see you all next month on the adventures.
Stay frosty.